Good evening, everybody. My name is Madhavi Phatak, and on behalf of Ecological Society of uh, in Pune, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you to the first of the Prakash Golem Memorial discussions that we are going to start today. The series is brought to you by the Ecological Society in partnership with A-Tree and is an initiative with the Alumni Association of Ecological Society, better known as Friends of Ecological Society, or in short, FES. I will briefly introduce Ecological Society and A-Tree and finish with a rundown of some of the logistics of participation. Ecological Society was established in the year 1982 by the late Sri Prakash Gole, in whose memory we are having this discussion today, who was a visionary ecologist and an economist in his own right. Ecological Society's mission is to work towards a sustainable society through research and education. It is based in Pune. The basket of projects undertaken by the Society over time include such projects as ecological guidelines for the riverfront development of Mula and Mutha rivers. The Pune folks will be familiar with this. The ecological management of the Pashwan Lake, the floral diversity improvement plan for the Mayureshwar Wildlife Sanctuary, assessment of the Panshed Dam catchment area, Ujjini Reservoir projects, and many more. The mainstay of the Society's program is, however, the one-year certificate course in sustainable management of natural resources and nature conservation. This is a unique and intensely interdisciplinary program which is being conducted by the Society since 1997. Since the beginning, the program has earned a reputation as a leading education in ecological approach to sustainability, development, and nature conservation. The program imparts theoretical concepts and helps participants gain field experience through camps and fieldwork. The unique ecological approach helps to develop an understanding of the connection between nature, economy, livelihoods, and conservation. Do visit our website for more information. Our partners A-Tree, or the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, is an academic think tank set up in 1996 and is based in Bangalore. Its mission is to generate rigorous interdisciplinary knowledge for achieving environmental conservation and sustainable development in a socially just manner, and to enable the use of this knowledge by policymakers and society, and also to train the next generation of scholarly leaders. Do visit the A-Tree website too for more information. The links will be provided in the chat box. Now for a brief rundown on the logistics of today's proceedings. The title of the webinar today is, What sort of an economy do we want? To deliberate upon this question, we have two panelists and a panel anchor. The panelists bring in a diversity of economic thinking that comes from the diversity in their respective spheres of work, which is crucial to a meaningful discussion. We at Ecological Society and A-Tree expect to bring in a lot more diversity as we move further into the series. In the last 6 months, virtual meeting rooms and lecture halls have become a reality. We are all well versed in the etiquettes of participating in such meetings, so I shall spare you a lecture on the topic. Other than the panelists, all other participants will be mute. You will, however, have the chat box and the question answer box available for interaction. You may use the chat box to express your opinions, agreements, disagreements, and appreciations with regard to the proceedings going on center stage. You may also use the chat box to share a whispered aside with a fellow participant. The Q&A box will be activated after the panel has spoken. Questions directed to the panel should be typed in this box. I repeat, questions to the panel may be typed out in the Q&A box. These questions will be moderated by Ajay Phatak and Gurudas Nulkar before directing them to the panel. We have over 700 registrations, while the capacity of this platform is only 500. The session will automatically be streamed on the Ecological Society's Facebook page once we start exceeding capacity. This session is being recorded and will also be available offline for viewing by the end of the week. I trust all of you are participating from the same safe confines of your homes and offices and know where to find the restrooms and the food. So let us all put on our hearing aids, thinking caps, and participate actively while we deliberate upon the question of what sort of an economy do we want. With this, I'll hand over to Ajay and to take the session further.
Thank you, Madhavi. And let me spend a few minutes on a little bit of history of how this particular series came about. So let me spend a few minutes on Prakash Gode Memorial series of discussion on understanding reality. I will then introduce the panel members as well as our anchor for today before passing on the baton to the anchor, Dr. Sharad Lele. Ecological Society has been conducting an annual lecture in the memory of Sri Prakash Gode, founder of the Ecological Society, for the last 6 years. In our discussions within Ecological Society and also the Ecological Society alumni we call Friends of Ecological Society, we were looking at going beyond the remit of a lecture. Our further discussion with Dr. Sharad Lele of ATREE helped us crystallize this thought process, and we thought of expanding this into a discussion series which would be broadcasted over the next 5 months, one similar session every month. We decided to start with a big picture, understand and formulate the problem first from social, ecological, economic perspective, and then go into some important sectors and questions around these before synthesizing the way forward. We also discussed the need of extending our outreach to the technocrats, corporates, and managers. This pandemic, interestingly, has created some new sensitivity among the not so initiated around issues of the environment and ecology. On the other hand, the economy and livelihoods have collapsed. Does this accentuate the fragility of the current economic system? The situation calls for a constructive conversation between the economist and an ecologist. In this spirit, we intend to dive deeper into key components of economy and ask more questions around our water resources, our food system, and the way our cities function today. The sessions which follow will raise the following questions. Water crisis, is there a way out? Is our food system sustainable? Do we really need to deconstruct our cities? With these questions raised and discussed, and having developed some good understanding of the real challenges, we will be in a much better position to get into the question of what can we do. We will then delve into synthesis and way forward towards economy of well-being. With this introduction of the series, let me now introduce today's panel and our anchor and steward. Dr. Ajit Ranade, most of you probably have already read his articles in Pune Mirror and Mumbai Mirror. Dr. Ajit Ranade is the chief economist at the Aditya Birla Group in Mumbai. Ajit did an undergraduate in electrical engineering at IIT Bombay, a management diploma at IIM Ahmedabad, and then went on to do a PhD in economics from Brown University. His professional career began in academia with faculty appointments at the Indira Gandhi Institute for Development Research, followed by the Indian Council of Research on International Economic Relations and Jawaharlal Nehru University. He then moved into the corporate sector, working for ABN AMRO Bank before moving to the Aditya Birla Group. Ajit is a member of many bodies in the corporate sector and has also served on many committees for the Government of India. He is also the co-founder of the Association for Democratic Reforms, a civil society group pushing for transparency in Indian politics. Now let's try and understand what Ashish has done. Ashish Kothari is one of the founders of Kalpavraksh, one of the oldest environmental advocacy NGO in India. A graduate in sociology, Ashish has taught environment at the Indian Institute of Public Administration. He has served on the Indian government's Environmental Appraisal Committee on River Valley projects and the Forest Rights Act Committee, among others. He coordinated India's National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan process. Ashish has also been active with a number of people's movements, including Narmada Bachao Andolan, Save Narmada movement, and Beach Bachao Andolan, Save the Seeds movement. Currently, Ashish helps coordinate the Vikalpa Sangam or Alternatives Confluence process in India and the global tapestry or alternatives globally. These efforts are focused on identifying and highlighting alternative ways of meeting human needs and aspirations without trashing the earth and without leaving half of humanity behind. Let me give you an introduction to Dr. Lele now. Sharat Chandra Lele got a BTech in electrical engineering from IIT Bombay in 1984, but then decided that environmental studies was far more exciting and socially relevant. So he did an MS on environmental impacts of large dams at Indian Institute of Sciences, Bangalore in 1987, and then a PhD in energy and resources from University of California at Berkeley in 1993, focusing on forest use in Western Ghats. Since then, he has worked at Pacific Institute, Harvard University, and Institute for Social and Economic Change. He co-founded the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Environment and Development in 2001 and led it till 2009, when it merged with the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment. He is now the Distinguished Fellow in Environmental Policy and Governance at ATRI. Sharad is an interdisciplinary researcher bridging the natural sciences, economics, and political science in trying to understand the concepts of the pathways to environmentally sustainable and socially just development. So with this introduction, I will pass the baton on to Sharad for taking this forward.
ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. Sagarna namaskar. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Ajay, for the introduction to the session and to the panel. Let me add from on ATRI's behalf also a welcome to everybody to this first of 5 sessions on understanding reality in memory of Shri Prakash Gode. I also want to add a personal angle to this because I had the good fortune of meeting Shri Prakash Gode way back in 1978 in a nature camp that he had organized in the NDA Khadakwasla campus. And in some sense, that was my introduction to bird watching, and through that to wildlife, and through that to environmental issues. So I owe him a debt that can, in a sense, that goes back all the way to my entry in this field. It's a real pleasure also, and thank you Ashish and Ajit for agreeing to be part of this conversation. We could not have had 2 more distinguished but also very active and eloquent spokespersons for trying to look at societal problems in ways that are different from conventional perspectives on what we should be doing, what kind of economy we should be having, what kind of a society we should be having. So let me jump directly into the conversation by posing something that's been bothering me for some time. And it recurred in the last few weeks when, after August 31st, there was a lot of hullabaloo in the newspapers that India's GDP had declined by 25%. And that was the big takeaway after 4 months of lockdown or 6 months of pandemic and so on, that our GDP had declined by 25%. And a lot of discussion, airtime spent in the newspapers, in the TV channels on this topic. And I think the focus on the GDP is a larger reflection in our society today of the focus on a variety of economic indicators. You just have to open a TV channel, a news channel, and you will see at the bottom, regardless of what news the newsreader is reading, the bottom banner is about share prices, about the stock market, and a variety of other such economic indicators. So it just got me wondering whether in today's context, when we have had a pandemic, we are still in the middle of it. In fact, you can say India is currently at the peak of the pandemic in some sense. For us to focus on GDP as an indicator of anything, as an indicator of even economic health, is that really making sense? Should we be looking at something else? How would you respond to this question of, an indicator of societal health in this period of pandemic? Maybe I'll start with Ajit and then go to Ashish.
Thank you, Sharad, and thanks to Ajay and Ecological Society and Atri also, of course, for inviting me. Sharad, one of the most, definitely the most finite resource we have, without any doubt and without any ambiguity, is time. So in the interest of time, because the topic is so vast and can be so deep, I'll try and keep my answers brief, but that is not to imply that the answers are simple or that the answers can be so crisp, because this topic is very vast and deep. So of course, GDP, is it the best way to measure society's health? I think that's what your question was. Of course, it's not the best way, and of course, it's not the only way. But we have to, what you want to understand, you measure. So, in case you want one shorthand way or one sort of easy to communicate, easy to understand measure of well-being of society, one of them happens to be GDP, which is nothing but the full form is gross domestic product, or it is also the aggregate of people's income. As you know, GDP is actually measured two different ways. You can add up everybody's income, each and every person's income. That is called national income. It's also called GDP. But conversely, from a flip side, you can also measure the value, rupee value of everything that's produced, goods and services produced and sold. And that's also in rupees, so that's also GDP. You will get exactly the same answer. The reason for that is every transaction that happens is income to somebody. Every transaction is, especially if it is, what should I say, a monetary, a rupee transaction or a market transaction, it involves somebody selling something to somebody else. So every transaction ends up being as income to somebody. So whether you measure the value of goods and services produced and sold, or whether you measure everybody's income, net income, you should get the same answer. So just now, as you said, we measure this income on a nationally very systematic way every 3 months. That's why we call it a quarter. So in the last quarter, the data for April, May, June usually comes after 2 months of delay. So the earliest you can know what happened during April, May, and June is the earliest you can know is 2 months later, which is 31st of August. And everybody, the news channels, the TV channels, they eagerly wait for that number as if it's a big mystery being unraveled. But of course, it's not that mysterious, because while economic activity happens during April and May and June, you can look around, common sense would tell you what's going on. So as you said, we discovered that the income for the nation as a whole, if you add up everybody's income, was roughly 24 or 25% lower than what it was during April, May, and June last year. So we measure it on a 12-month basis, year to year. But that is not so surprising, because basically we had a shutdown. This was the 3-month period when factories were shut down, when there was a pretty harsh lockdown all over the country. Restaurants were in cities, especially, everything that had a footfall, whether it's restaurants, malls, cinemas, airlines were shut, hospitality, tourism. So if you just shut down all economic activity, there are no transactions. There are very few transactions. And merely as a result of that itself, you can have a decline in people's income. So what did people do? Well, they resorted to their savings or their neighbors or help from friends, non-monetary, in a non-GDP sense. So that's what happened. So when you ask me, is GDP the only measure of how society is doing? No, of course not. But that's the best we got, I think, approximately. I mean, I don't want to take too much time. I think we should leave time for more and more discussion questions. So I'll stop there. Just to 1 more minute I'll take. You see, think of a husband, wife, and kids living at home, and maybe they have the grandparents. It's a joint family. Okay, both the husband and wife are working, but their kids are young. They are not yet school going. So when they go and earn their incomes, which become part of GDP, their children are looked after by the grandmother and grandfather. Both of them are retired. Okay. For some reason, the grandmother and grandfather then have to go back to some native village, native place. So then the kids cannot be looked after. So luckily, in the neighborhood, they have a very, very good, reliable lady who runs a daycare center. So instead of the grandparents taking care of the kids while the husband and wife work, after the grandparents have left, they start taking their kids to the daycare center from 9 o'clock till 5 o'clock in the evening. For that, they have to pay a fee, which is nominal. Thankfully, it's not very expensive. What happened is immediately GDP went up, just because the same childcare which was being provided by the grandparents now happens through a monetary transaction between the caregiver, the childcare center. So if you ask me did society's quality of life change? Maybe not, or maybe some people may say the love and affection that grandparents give is less than what a love and affection that the best healthcare daycare center can give. But from a GDP perspective, GDP actually went up. When the children started going to daycare center, GDP went up. So that's, I hope this microcosmic example captures what I'm trying to say. So your question is deep, but we can't, this is a brief answer.
Thanks, Ajit. Ashish?
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, well, firstly, thanks a lot to Ecological Society and ATRI for this opportunity. It's always great to be able to talk to people from different, I shouldn't say sides, but sort of different sectors, because otherwise we end up talking just within our own small bubbles and circles. So it's wonderful. Also, a quick memoriam to Prakash. Just like you, I also met him many decades back as a ace birder and ornithologist. And of course, later on as a very offbeat economist. So it's wonderful to have this series in his honor. I think taking what Ajit said at the end, the anecdote that he gave at the end a little bit further, I remember, I think it was the economist Peugeot who said, if I marry my cook, the GDP falls, which was a very succinct way of telling how ridiculous a figure GDP is. And there are many other such similar things. You cut down a forest and sell it as timber, the GDP goes up. You then put in soil soil conservation measures, the GDP goes up, etc., etc. Meanwhile, the quality of life of the village that's dependent on that forest is continuously falling. What we've also seen, and we did a very detailed analysis of this in our book, Aseem Srivastava and I, in the book Churning the Earth, is how GDP growth is actually not at all connected to even things like employment. So we've had very high levels of growth since 1991-92, except in the last 3-4 years. But yet we've also had the phenomenon of jobless growth in the formal sector. And we see with COVID that the vast sector of workforce in India remains or has actually become even more vulnerable to these kinds of crises. So then where is all that GDP growth going? And of course, we know it's also partly going, I think you have something on inequality, maybe we can discuss that later. It's going to a very small section of society. So I think it's important to realize that what you can count is not necessarily what's countable. I'm paraphrasing, I think, Einstein, when he said what counts is not necessarily countable, and what's countable is not necessarily what counts. And so what are the indicators that actually should be applied is, of course, like Ajit said, a very, very complex question. But we have so many examples from around the world of different kinds of indicators of well-being, both qualitative, and I would really strongly stress that, both qualitative and quantitative, and even some country level. For instance, Bhutan and its gross national happiness. There are many problems with it, but it certainly seems to be a way better approach than just GDP. Or New Zealand now actually also going down the direction of looking at its latest budget. If I if I'm not mistaken, is trying to emphasize things like mental well-being as an indicator. Or if you go back to Gandhian economics and Kumarappa's economics of permanence, many different ways in which one can actually measure, is a society doing well or not. But the second issue there is also the issue of who is applying indicators for what purpose and on whom. And I think this relates really to the issue of the centralization of the economy and of decision making with regard to the economy and of course politics. And where you then start saying, okay, it's the government that is applying, or some World Bank or somebody like that who's applying these indicators. And for that to happen, they have to have a very simplistic quantitative measure. That's the only way to say, okay, are you developed or not developed? Because they don't have the wherewithal or the interest or the ability to actually go to every community and say, okay, who's really happy, who's satisfied, who has clean drinking water, who has adequate nutritious food and not. So you then club all of that into these simplistic aggregated figures, which to my mind make no sense whatsoever. So we have to fundamentally alter not just the economics, not just the indicators, but also this whole issue of who is actually applying these in what way. And I think if we maybe later, if we talk about sort of radically different approaches that people have taken to well-being, including economic well-being, where communities are able to decide, yes, in fact, are we doing well or not, then the whole picture shifts radically, because then you can put lots of qualitative indicators in along with the quantitative ones.
Thanks, Ashish. I just wanted to take this discussion a little further by saying, Ajit, that was a nice example about the lacunae or the limitations of GDP as an indicator of let's say well-being or even economic well-being. But is there more to that than just this particular limitation? So one is the imperfection of the indicator, because a lot of activities are not captured in the market itself. I mean, the example you gave of grandparents taking care of grandchildren is really an off-market or a non-market activity, and when it shows up in the market, then GDP goes up, and so that's the imperfection of your indicator. But I was just wondering if GDP growth as an aspiration for a nation, or for national policymakers, for governments, measuring all their performances or constantly being badgered by various people saying, oh, your GDP growth rate is not high enough. It used to be 8%, now it's at 4%. That's a disaster, etc. So beyond that indicator, in a sense, is the idea that economic growth is a good thing. Well, as you said, GDP tries to capture income, and it might be imperfect in doing that. A lot of activities are happening in a non-measurable sense. If a farmer grows food and consumes that food, that income is not measured, because it's both income and consumption, and that is completely outside the normal GDP calculus. You would have to do some special tweaks to pick that up in your calculation. But I was just thinking whether the underlying idea that societal well-being is reasonably well captured by, let's say, the aggregation of everybody's income. Right? Let's assume for a moment that we are perfectly measuring that income, including that subsistence farmer, including the grandparents who are quote unquote providing childcare services, to put it in a very crass sense. Let's assume for a moment it's all captured. But is it a good idea as a fundamental concept to try to say that gross national income is a reasonable proxy for a society's well-being? And the reason I say that is because the second challenge to GDP, which is that it's the aggregate. Even so gross national income by definition is an aggregate indicator. And so if my well-being has gone up in the last 3 months because for whatever reason, I made money out of the pandemic, I'm running a chemical lab or something like that. But where the vast majority of the people have, let's say, lost incomes, the summation of the two is not particularly helpful, right? And so in that, or if Mr. Ambani's income has gone up in the last 6 months, which apparently it has, or Mr. Jeff Bezos, to look at a global picture, Jeff Bezos' income has shot up like crazy, and certainly his wealth has gone up by a large fraction in the last 6 months. So, do we really care about, as a society, should we be even worried about Jeff Bezos' income or Mr. Ambani's income, right? Or anybody in that income category for that matter, right? Or should we be really worrying about the lower half of the lower, 60% or 70% of the population, which is way below, anywhere close to those numbers? And depending on how you measure poverty and so on, it could be 30%, it could be 25% or 20%. But the point being that should we not be directly looking at the well-being of the poorest? And so at the very least, we would want to think about a GDP of the poor rather than GDP of everybody. And more importantly, then again, ask the same question really, how do we capture inequity in society more generally? Should we look at jobs? Should we look at the jobs only of the poorest? Should we look at assets owned by the poorest? So I just wanted to push this question that, you know, the GDP sort of as a particular indicator or a calculation, yes, there are some, you know, clearly limitations. Ashish pointed out the environmental limitations. If you cut down the forest, it shows up in the market, then it's a temporarily boost in income. You don't know what's going to happen 10 years from now when the whole hillside has eroded and you have the silt sitting in the dam. But apart from those imperfections, the very idea that economic growth is good for everyone. Maybe the poorest gain a little bit, the richest gain a bigger chunk of that growth, but everybody's in a sense rising up because everybody's floating in this rising tide in some sense. Is that even true? I mean, aren't there clearly losers and winners in this whole process?
Yeah, so Sharad, there's actually in asking your questions, you're bundled in so many other questions. So I'll try to disentangle each one of them. First of all, I think let me talk about two different concepts. Anyway, the short answer, let me just give you the short answer. Is economic growth good for society? Yes. Answer is yes. But we can debate that later. But let me put it up front. Firstly, let's distinguish between the concept of poverty and inequality. I think we said we'll talk about inequality later, but it's obviously by mentioning Ambani and Bezos, you brought in that, and by mentioning aggregation. So poverty is an absolute concept, okay? That means that poverty can be defined in terms of basic needs like food. And you need about 2,400 kilocalories or whatever, or, you know, food, in fact, proteins and carbohydrates and all can be converted into kilocalories. So you can have a universal definition of poverty. And at the very least, society should make sure that nobody goes hungry. You know, we can agree that this is a very basic human value. And, you know, compared to up to 1960s, we had to go with a begging bowl to other countries because we are a nation state, right? This is a modern concept. We became an independent republic. We became a republic in 1950. So we had to depend on our own resources, but we simply didn't have enough food to feed our own people. So we used to actually have to import, and that to you know, accept a pretty you know, stringent conditions for those exports and food aid. So at least compared to the 1960s, today, I think at least we think we are able to produce enough food for us. So poverty means how many people are not able to get even 2 square meals a day. Okay. And that's an absolute concept. It's a universal concept. It doesn't, I mean, whereas inequality is a relative concept. Inequality means how much is the gap between the rich and the poor. So you can have, you know, theoretically, you can have a society where everybody's income is more than $100,000. And yet the inequality coefficient, which is measured as a ratio of between rich to poor, can be much higher than a poor country. I mean, I like to give a classic, it's a caricature. The example is of, say, Cuba, where if everybody is poor, inequality is non-existent. It's a very highly egalitarian, equal society. Or you can have, let's say, I don't know, Brunei or Saudi Arabia, I don't know the statistics. So you can have a rich country with high inequality, but no poor people, no poverty. Or you can have a poor country with no inequality, but a lot of people going hungry. But this is just for the sake of argument. But of course, these two concepts are intertwined. But it's important to keep the distinction in mind. So at the very least, we should aim for removal of poverty. Okay. Second point. So this is just, first point is just to distinguish the two. Second point is that all said and done, if you look at our own history, last 30, 40 years, you know, the very fact that you and I and all of us are able to interact, we are able to talk to each other because some people, you know, private entrepreneurs, public sector units, they laid down copper cables, fiber optic cables. We developed a telecom infrastructure in the country. We are now in a situation where I think a lot of, maybe, I don't know, 80% of Indians have access to a telephone. Okay. So surely isn't that, you know, is there something unambiguously bad about it? I think that's a good sign. If you look at the number of children who are going to school, if you look at indicator, so my second point is about GDP. You said, is GDP good? Actually, GDP is a proxy for inputs. But what we really want to measure, if you want to say well-being of society, you want to measure output, not input. So income and rupees and all that is input. Output is things like life expectancy. You know, in 1947, the average life expectancy of an Indian was maybe 45, 50 years. Today, it is close to 70 years. Output is things like literacy. What is the literacy rate? You know, it may be imperfect. Output is things like infant mortality. In out of 1,000 childbirths, how many children just die at childbirth because they don't have adequate healthcare facility? Today, the infant mortality rate has come down sharply. Maybe it's not as good as what it needs to be. So these are the kind of, you know, these are the quality of life indices. You can say air quality, you can say water quality. So and to Ashish's point, you know, cutting down timber. You know, Sharad, surely you know that there is elaborate environmental accounting practices and principles where we can actually, even if we are going to allow people to cut timber, we can make it in such a way that it is prohibitively expensive. We just don't have those kind of right pricing. That again will come through GDP. You might know that the most sustainable forestry in the world is done by countries like Finland and Sweden and Canada. You know, these are countries, surely you're not going to say that they are in miserable state. So just cutting down timber cannot be an absolute. And finally, you know, when we talk about aggregation of references, will community, how do we know that this is good for society or not? You know, who Marathi मध्ये म्हणायचं की ही मक्तेदारी कोणाला द्यायची? Are you, Mr. Dr. Sharatchandra Lele, are you the person who will decide, or is Mr. Ashish Kothari going to decide? For that, we need to ask the public, right? The person who is, you know, you ask, you know, the only way we can do it is to elicit what does the person think? The person who is going to be affected by GDP growth or absence of GDP growth. Unfortunately, we'll have to also have aggregate preferences. There'll be, you know, in India, there are 1 billion people. How do you aggregate their preferences? Well, unfortunately, we have a very imperfect system called voting and democracy. So decisions that, and then we delegate those decisions to our representatives. They are called people representatives. We call them MLA or MP, and they're the ones who take decisions. So the timber cutting, which Ashish doesn't like, we can collectively put pressure on to change policies. And surely our environmental policies are much better than 1980s or 1960s. So it's imperfect, but I think the project, and all of this is possible if we have good economic growth. Now we can talk about the quality of growth. We can talk about making sure that everything gets accounted. If you're going to cut a tree, make it prohibitively expensive. Have taxation policies. If cutting a tree has huge externality, negative effect on the environment, factor that into the pricing of that, and into the fees that you charge for timber merchants. You know, just I'll take one more minute. When you grow a cotton plant, you pluck its white, you know, the flowers, that is called cotton, and you make fiber out of it, then you make yarn, then you make a fabric and garment, and you wear, that's called a cotton shirt, right? Similarly, if you grow a eucalyptus tree and you cut the top part of it, it's called, I think it's called dissolving grade pulp. You make pulp out of it, and you make a forest where you cut only 1/7 of the forest this year, 1/7 next year, 1/7. So in 7 years, you go to the last 7, but by then the first tree has already grown. That's called sustainable forestry. But that wood pulp is used to, in a chemical process, to make viscose, which is what we use in, you know, polyester. Polyester is from crude oil. So there is such a thing as sustainable forestry as well. But that has to be priced properly. If we take a completely binary position, then you know, all democracy is all about negotiations and compromises. And hopefully we don't let the power and the economic and political power get concentrated in one source. That's where we can discuss about inequality. Okay. But you know, I think ultimately the person who will endorse this or not endorse it is the person who's going to be affected. You know, the so-called poor person.
Ashish?
Yeah, I think, well, number of things, very complex. It's very hard to actually respond to this question in any short time. But a few things here. I think some of the indicators that Ajit mentioned in terms of, for instance, the fact that we are able to be on this webinar suggests that, yes, there has been certain levels of progress and we're able to enjoy some of the benefits of that. But it would be very interesting to ask the 30 or 40 million people who are going to be displaced from Bangladesh's coastal areas and India's coastal areas in the next few years because of climate crisis, what they think of economic growth, and whether they think that having internet is in fact better than having access to a good place where they can survive and thrive and have a sustainable, secure, and not scary future. To my mind, what economic growth has done in the last few decades, it's hidden these so-called externalities. Now you can talk all we want about how those externalities can be brought in and so on and so forth, but there's very little evidence anywhere in the world of that having happened. We take Scandinavia. It's a great example again of hiding its huge ecological costs behind a so-called sustainable forestry system. If you were to ask Scandinavia to depend only on its own resources for its consumption patterns, it would fall flat within a few days, completely collapse ecologically. It takes resources from people like us and then sends us their toxic wastes, right? So Japan protects its forests because it takes a significant amount of its hardwood from Southeast Asia, displacing local communities and destroying the wildlife in the forest there. Economic growth as a paradigm is unsustainable, and it is inherently unequitable. 60 million people have been displaced, physically displaced in India alone, by projects that have been made in the name of economic growth and development. I'm just talking about physical displacement. If you count the number of people who've been physically dispossessed of land, of water, of forests, of XYZ, the numbers would be much higher. The latest National Nutrition Survey, which the government has hidden and never brought out, but the latest National Nutrition Survey says that actually nutritionally, rural India is doing much worse than it was 20 years back or 30 years back. Even the amount of food it is eating is less. Just sheer amount of food per capita is less than what it was 30 years back. So what we are seeing is that the so-called trickle down that's supposed to happen with growth, nothing is trickling down. Things are actually trickling up because their resources, forest dwellers, pastoralists, farmers, are being taken up by those who are becoming richer and richer and richer. And this is, in fact, therefore, also a very crucial relationship between inequality and absolute poverty and deprivation. I agree with what Ajit says, that there's no necessary relationship, but in a country like India, it is absolutely linked. In the same book that I mentioned earlier, what we looked at was to see if we think of poverty as not just 1.25 or $1.5 per capita income, which is the stupid World Bank figure that is given, but if we see it in terms of, do people have adequate nutritious food? Do we have clean drinking water? Do we have clean air? Do we have adequate access to health care and education facilities, sanitation, housing, clothing? I'm not talking about the non-tangible basic needs, just the tangible basic needs. And according to us, and you can see the book for the detailed statistics, most of which are from government, 70% of India is deprived, is poor. Was this the case 60 years back? I don't know. Even if you take something like food production, yes, food production has increased, but at what cost? If you look at we have to look at also the benefit of not just the current generation, but also the future generations. If we are robbing the future generations of the very soil on which we are growing the food, the very water on which is being contaminated, and so on and so forth, then I don't understand how this growth can in any way be thought of as being good. Finally, and this is, I think, very important, can many of the benefits or all the benefits that we do see with economic development not happen without growth? I mean, I go back to 3 years back. I was in a village in Telangana, a Dalit women farmer who has 2.5 acres of dry land, growing food with her own seeds, no chemical fertilizers, no pesticides, no external input. She claims food sovereignty, which is complete control over her food. She was growing enough for an 8-member family for the whole year, plus selling 2 lakh rupees worth in the market. This is dry land and local seeds, completely organic. Now, does she need economic growth for this to happen? Or do we need a very different paradigm in which, in fact, people take control over their lives, where we can support, where the government should be supporting instead of taking things away from them, that's the true Atmanirbharta, not what Mr. Modi is talking about, then economic growth actually becomes something that could happen as a consequence of this, but not economic growth as a means to reach this, because it's not actually happening, to my mind, apart from all the ecological destruction. The only reason I gave the timber example was to actually talk about the ridiculousness of GDP as an indicator. I wasn't saying that no tree should be cut at all. So that's a whole different issue. Finally, I think it was in 1991 or 92 that Dr. Manmohan Singh gave a lecture on the new economic reforms and environment. And I asked him this question at that point. SPWD had organized it. I said, how do you reconcile the two? I mean, when will you start protecting the environment? And when is economic growth going to be trumping the environment? I use the word trumping deliberately. He said, when we are able to make enough money, when the economy is rich enough, we'll put it back into environmental protection. Let's see what's happening now. We are talking about 1991, where almost 30 years later, the Ministry of Environment still gets less than 0.5% of the budget. The Ministry of Environment is made to give clearances in the ecologically most sensitive parts of the country in the middle of a lockdown with online decisions. There is no way in which ecological sensitivity can get put into a system in which growth is the mantra of everything. It is the mantra. Every finance minister has told us growth at all costs. At least they're honest, because it actually is at all costs. You can't get in the way. If you get in the way of growth, you're labeled urban Naxal, a terrorist, anti-development, anti-national, and everything else. Whereas in fact, we see communities like the woman I spoke about, who in fact have reached levels of food security or livelihood security without this roundabout approach of first let's do economic growth and then come back to seeing whether people are benefiting or not. So we need just very fundamentally different paradigms of what we mean by this. And I think the climate crisis is telling us very much that economic growth is fundamentally faulty. And later maybe we can talk about whether decoupling is possible or not, because that's what the other thing is, green growth. Now you do green growth by which you decouple the impacts, and we can talk about that later.
Thanks, Ashish. I was just going to put forth a proposition that, something that I'd also written about in 1991. I think the point you made, Ajit, about growth or GDP for that matter, economic or economic measure of income, is not really the outcome you're focusing on. The outcome is life expectancy, infant mortality, health, nutrition. Ashish pointed out nutrition, food security, and so on, right? So roti, kapda, makan, and a little bit more. The intangibles that Ashish just kind of mentioned in passing. Intangibles being as important, perhaps. My ability to go out and be amongst trees and birds and not only in a concrete jungle could be a very significant part of the intangible. If we said that these are really the outcomes we want, and we want them at a minimal level for everybody, your point that nobody should be poor by these thresholds of poverty. One might even say we want an equitable society for its own sake. Let us park that for a moment. But that's an important conversation which we may not be able to have in our time constraint. But going beyond poverty removal to actually talking about an equitable society. But if we said that we really want to focus on the outcomes, then the idea that economic growth will get us to those outcomes is a hypothesis. It's not a given. It's a hypothesis, and it depends upon the claim of trickle down. It tells us that, well, with economic growth, what Manmohan ji said, the income growth will then eventually lead us to do this, that, and the other. And that assumption of trickle down depends upon, or at least that economic growth will not destroy livelihoods, will not undermine food security or health, or in the case of climate change, actually threaten everybody who's living on the coastline or in the Himalayas. Depends upon huge assumptions about how economic growth is happening and how the markets within which that growth is happening are functioning, right? For example, as you said, you could have had taxes on carbon. I mean, the biggest, so the so-called mother of all environmental crises, although I don't like that phrase, but the idea that climate change is a huge crisis, it's a global crisis, it's a crisis created by all those who have been pumping fossil fuel or been burning fossil fuels for the last 100 years, in which our share has perhaps been small so far. And the economist's answer to that would have been, oh, well, we need to price carbon correctly, or we need to price coal and petroleum correctly. But in the absence of that situation, which is the reality today, and we don't have any, we are not even, I think, 100 years close to pricing petroleum where it should be priced. It's a given. It's a given that we will overconsume petroleum, we will over-emit CO2, and therefore destroy a whole bunch of people's lives and livelihoods. And it seems almost that even when we measure, even when as an environmental economist, I did my training in Berkeley, whatever, one of the points that Richard Norgaard pointed out is that even when we measure the environmental harm caused by an economic activity such as pollution, the way we are measuring and aggregating that harm or subtracting it from the economic growth is by using prices which are set in an unequal economy. And a classic example is dams, where if you had to measure the loss of livelihoods to the people whose lands got submerged or the forest got submerged by the dam, you would put a price on the firewood that came from the forest, which is the price in the village of poor people. You know, not the price, the value of the forest as reflected in an urban market, because the transaction is happening in a poor economy, not in the rich economy. So given a highly unequal economy, A, and given B, huge market failures in the sense of inability to price the environmental impacts of almost everything that's happening in terms of the economic process or the industrial process, it seems to me that we are so far away from the GDP reflecting anything that we might say that, well, it's neither necessary nor sufficient to have economic growth in order to achieve those outcomes that you were talking about. I mean, the Cuban example that you gave is of low economic growth and high achievements on these physical quality of life indicators, right? So I'm just thinking that you neither need economic growth to get there, nor is high economic growth assuring that you will get there. So it's neither necessary nor sufficient. I sort of want to park that possibility or that thought with the audience. We are running short of time, so we spend the rest of our conversation only on that. But just wanted to get a little bit further on this question of sustainable economy and the idea of, because we're talking about the economy, right? And I think Ashish is making the point that economic growth as an objective is perhaps underpinned by a certain structure of our economy and what we will call a capitalist economy. We today live in a capitalist economy, although we started out maybe as a mixed economy, whatever it is. And I think that's a very interesting question to ask. In the limited, we have about 10 minutes before I open it up to a sort of a Q&A from the audience. So I just wanted to pose this last question, which is that it almost seems that economic growth is the imperative of capitalism. Economic growth by itself doesn't guarantee anything. It could guarantee more inequality and even more poverty and more environmental destruction. It might not. So it's kind of a bit of a going in ways that are maybe irrelevant to what we are really concerned about on the one side. And it's the inevitable outcome of capitalism. And then you add the environmental angle to it. And I wanted to add the issue of fossil fuels there, because it seems to me that the upward trajectory of capitalism as a way in which society is organized, its economy, coincides with the emergence of fossil fuels. And that's possibly because fossil fuels generate the kind of surplus that is absolutely unheard of in feudal systems which are based on, let's say, farming. Farming does produce surplus, and landlords would appropriate the surplus and keep the rest of the guys as tenants on that piece of land. And that process was already happening. But the kind of surplus that petroleum and coal generate, and the technologies that developed as a result of fossil fuels, seems to be just so inordinately high. What is it called? The energy return on energy investment, 100:1, gives you the kind of surplus that then, of course, there will be huge attempts to appropriate that surplus, and you will get a sort of a capitalistic situation. And so I wanted to get at this question of, is capitalism the source of the problem of environmental degradation and inequality, or are these just kind of going to happen because of a particular way in which we have managed capitalism? Are there other ways of managing capitalism that might perhaps not give us these outcomes, or give us much better outcomes in terms of poverty alleviation and environmental sustainability? Maybe I'll start with Ashish first.
Well, you certainly hit one of the nails on the head. I think that it's inherent in capitalism to keep growing. That's the indication you're giving, and I completely agree with that. And unless we actually fundamentally question it, I don't think we're going to have anything of the theoretical part of what was being talked about earlier in terms of being able to internalize the costs and things like that. Capitalism will not tolerate that. And I wanted to get here to the issue of green growth, because that's what capitalism is. And another issue also saying that it's not just capitalism, there are other factors also. But so green growth, which is now being proposed, or green capitalism also some people say, as being the solution to this, where capitalism is also accepting the fact that ecological damage is a problem. If you look at decoupling and studies that have been done around the world of this notion that you can actually continue having growth, but put in the technological efficiencies and so on, so that in fact per unit of growth that is there does not have the same ecological cost, has been shown to be completely false. If you look at where in fact this per unit decoupling has happened in some parts of the world, the overall materials and energy consumption has still kept going up. This is across the global north if you look at it, and therefore the impacts on the environment, on the climate, are also continuously going up. And there are inherent reasons for this, one of which is the need for capitalism to keep growing. But I also wanted to say here, Sharad, that I think it's important not to put all our eggs or all the blame on capitalism. There are other structural factors here. And especially if you're looking at alternatives, we also need to look at things like the concentration of power in the state, which is what I hinted at earlier when I was talking about who is applying the indicators, for whom, for what purpose, etc. And the same thing you can talk, who takes a decision on whether the tree should be cut or not, who takes a decision on XYZ, right? And if you concentrate power in private corporations under capitalism, or in the state under state-dominated socialism, and then going even further back in men in patriarchy. So one needs to look at that also as a fundamental structural force, which sometimes underlies both capitalism and statism. And then others like casteism and racism and so on. So I think unless we look at the economy and both the problems and the alternatives from these fundamental structural points of view, we will be giving very superficial solutions like carbon trading and green growth, which are not really going to save the planet from what's happening. So that's a short answer to, again, a very complex thing. But I did want to add something on the kinds of transformation needed. So maybe if you permit, after Ajit has spoken, then we'll,
Yeah, so Sharad, actually you're asking, very basic question, and the question presupposes that we all, have a well-defined concept called capitalism. First of all, the capitalism of the kind that we are discussing is a very modern concept, maybe 300 years old.
Yeah.
And I would say what you see in China is what I would call state capitalism.
Yeah.
Every rule that you can think of is China does exactly what a capitalist society does, except that most of the enterprises are state-owned. There's the same capitalist mode of production, and so it's state capitalism. And on the other hand, I don't see there is any country which is purely capitalistic, even in the so-called, the icon of capitalism, which is America. Government expenditure is probably much more than India, as a percentage of GDP. And even the most socialist countries you can think of, including say Vietnam or the Scandinavian countries, have a very high degree of capitalism. So, we really don't have, the way we use the term, we don't really have a benchmark where it's purely. We can discuss what I said very early in our conversation, that once we agree that what we want is not the inputs, which is GDP or rupees and dollars, but what we want is the outcome indicators, such as infant mortality, such as life expectancy, or literacy, or air quality, or access to drinking water. Or you can say, in some advanced countries, even right to internet has become a basic fundamental right, or right to electricity. The Delhi government apparently had a policy where they'll give 300 units of electricity to every household in Delhi. So even I'm told in Scandinavian countries, in Sweden, even if you're in prison, you cannot be denied access to internet. Or in Netherlands, they had to close a lot of prisons because there were no inmates. Now, is that an indicator of quality of life in those societies? I'll give you one more example. There is a country in the world today whose citizens' life expectancy is among the highest in the world, maybe 90 years. They have relatively low incidence of obesity, a sign of affluence. They have low incidence of heart disease, relatively. They have very high, among the rich country peers, they have very high degree of rainfall. They have very high forest cover. Okay. You know what that country is? That country is called Japan. And what has the Japanese economy done? For the last 30 years, not 10, 20, 30 years, since 1990, the Japanese economy has grown at a GDP growth rate of 0%. Okay. And still it's the second richest country in the world, I would say, second or third richest in per capita. It is still a source of great innovation in miniature electronics, in electric cars, in whatever scientific discoveries. So that's possible. I'm saying another example is South Korea, which at the end of the Korean War was so devastated. I'm talking about South Korea, that almost it lost 80 or 90% of the forest cover because it was bombed out. It was a proxy war between the USSR and America. Completely bombed out country in 1953-56, just 50-60 years ago. Today it has 85% of forest cover. It is the only country which has made a transition from being a developing country to a rich economy, which is the select elite group of OECD countries. Look at there again, all these indicators: access to drinking water, access to life expectancy, medical level of healthcare. Now you ask an average citizen in the world, would you rather live in these countries? Forget about the social and cultural and language problems. So ultimately, what's the right word? I mean, who is going to make this choice? We can't be making the choice on behalf of, each individual. The Dalit woman that Ashish talked about, you have to go and ask her, would you like access to a better hospital? She may be making enough money to be able to feed her family and in a zero chemical fertilizer or something. We have to ask her, what is her aspiration? And this is, we have to have a collection of aspirations, everybody, and we have to somehow find a way to reflect that collective aspiration. Now, the only mechanism that I know of is to live in a democratic society. Now, in democracy, it's all about negotiation of power. Like Ashish said, we cannot have concentration of power, whether it's economic power or political power. Democracy and the market economy is nothing but a continuous negotiation of these power structures. That's why we care for decentralization. In 93, 94, we passed a radical, a remarkable constitutional amendment, the 73rd and 74th Amendment, which is devolution of power and funds to the third tier, which is municipalities, village councils, Jilla Parishads, district centers. But we are not actually, after 25 years, we've still not even funds, functions, and functionaries. We have not been able to give control of their own lives to the people. The richest city, so-called richest city in Mumbai, in Asia, Mumbai Municipal Corporation, has a land which is worth gold. But it's a very poor corporation. Why? Because the property tax rates are nothing. And why are the property tax rates not being able to decide? Why can't the municipality or citizens of Mumbai able to decide their own property tax rates? Because they are at the mercy of the state government. They have to go to Mantralaya. So so democracy is nothing but negotiation of power. We need to decentralize. We need to have countervailing power centers. Same thing in the market economy. And we never got to that, but we can park that question. Let's not take it up. But basically, when you have too much inequality, you have too much concentration of power. That's where you need to have corrective measures. And
thanks, Ajit. I'm going to start picking up some questions from the Q&A chat box. This was really very useful. I think there's clearly a certain area of congruence as we come towards the end of the first hour. And I want to pick up on this last point about the political system, because Ashish also flagged this point that it is the economic structure in parallel with the political system that is highly centralized. And so there was a question from Yogesh Pathak which says, how do we tie incentives for politicians to be thinking about well-being and not be thinking about just the input that whether it's economic growth or something else? but actually thinking about the outcomes. So I think it relates to the points that both of you made towards the end, which was about the political structures, the need to decentralize. But I just wanted to take that a little further, saying even in a decentralized economy, whether it's Mumbai, it could very well happen that even if the state government allowed Mumbai Municipal Corporation to raise property taxes, the rich and powerful in Mumbai, of which there are quite a few, and they wield a lot of power, would never allow Mumbai Municipal Corporation to raise those taxes. So I'm just throwing out this as a hypothesis, but saying that, can we talk a little bit more about this question of how do we incentivize politicians to think in these deeper questions, on these deeper questions of what we want out of economic growth?
No, because all of us have to engage. It's not like we can think of one system, oh, it'll work for everything. It's a constant. Democracy is nothing but a constant negotiation. Democracy is conversations. So no voter or citizen can give up their responsibility. Everybody has to get engaged. Unless that happens, why do we have 30-40% of criminals in legislatures, whether it's state level legislatures or in parliament? Because people voted for them, and people voted for them despite knowing, the records and affidavits. These are self-sworn affidavits.
So what? Just wanted to ask Ashish, what's the reason for this, and how would that change? The incentive for voters to vote in criminals, for instance. What kind of reforms would you visualize?
So I think, Sharad, we have to go back to the original meaning of democracy. Democracy is not about power of those we elect and the bureaucrats that they choose. It's about us. What Ajit is saying, each one of us actually is the locus of power in what would be a genuine democracy. And I want to go back to what Gandhiji said was Swaraj, because Swaraj is a very different notion than the current liberal notion of democracy, where once in 5 years we go to the troop over to the election booth and then hope that for the next 5 years the government will do the right thing for us. Whereas in fact, what Swaraj is that we are claiming the power where we are. We are doing what, for instance, Mendhalekha village in Gadchiroli district of Maharashtra says that, okay, we elect the government in New Delhi, but in our village, we are the government. And they have refused to allow a paper mill to come and destroy their bamboo, or government officers to come and take decisions for that whole village. They've said the Gram Sabha will be taking the decision. The Pathalgadi movement in Jharkhand was saying Gram Sabha is over and above the Lok Sabha. That's actually what democracy is about. And if we do that, then we actually start inverting the power relationship also of the economy. Because then people like us in cities do not necessarily have easy access to take minerals from wherever we want, and wood from wherever we want, and water from wherever we want, and then throw our garbage wherever we want. Because then each of these communities is empowered to say, no, we're not going to give you stuff that is actually going to impact our own livelihoods and our survival. Let's build a more mutually respectful relationship of what would be of benefit both to you and to us. And we see, in fact, that beginning to happen in many parts of the world where people are asserting this Swaraj kind of notion. So the reason why the example I gave of the Dalit woman farmer, and yes, it would be wonderful if on this set of programs you call her and ask her for her aspirations, because in fact, she's saying precisely this. She's saying that in COVID times, no health problems here, no food insecurity problems here. We're fine with our health because we're eating very healthy foods, etc., etc. We come with this notion saying, oh, there's not a hospital in your village, and so therefore you must be deprived. There are different forms of health systems. There are different forms of education and learning systems also, not the only sort of monocultural ones that we have in mind. And I think at the end of the day, we have to keep Gandhi's talisman and take it further in mind. Does any economic decision taken by anybody actually help the most deprived person or not? When wealth tax is cut and when corporation taxes are removed, which is what this government has done, that talisman is in nobody's mind. I want to take that talisman further as my last point here to say not just the last person, but the last living being. Do all the economic decisions we take also respect the rest of life or not? Or are we saying, well, no, human beings are made to rule the earth, and so therefore we can ride roughshod over all other species? So it's this combination of looking at what really benefits the most marginalized and deprived sections of population, what economic decisions, and what is it that will also respect other species. that I think needs to be very squarely at the center of economics, which it's not right now.
Just wanted to link this back a little bit, Ajit, to the point you made. Maybe switching tracks a little bit to go back, because there's a question in the question and answer box. A little bit going back to the economic side of the story. And you gave the example of Japan or South Korea for that matter. And yes, they have, as Ashish had also earlier pointed out, they have high forest cover, so they superficially look green. But the biggest driver of their economic well-being today, even let's say assume zero GDP growth for the moment, they are already at a high level of GDP per capita. But the biggest the biggest driver of that high level of GDP is petroleum, right? Which doesn't occur in Japan, but certainly is burnt in Japan, and is polluting the whole world and causing all the consequences of climate change that we all know about. This example has a very limited value because I think we are ignoring the visible sign is green cover or forest cover or something, but the invisible, the CO2 that is spewed, the air pollution that occurs, and you can clean up Los Angeles for air pollution, but you cannot really get rid of the CO2 from that pollution, because that the whole capitalist economy, and I'm not saying just capitalist, I think I would actually go back to saying industrialist economy is built on the fossil subsidy.
What's the question,
right?
though?
So the question is, maybe it's beyond just the question of capitalism to a dependence on a particular form of industrialism, which is based upon consumptive use of resources, right? And
No,
not
but Sharad, let me point out, that's why I didn't take the example. I could have easily given you the example of Singapore, which is completely recycling all seawater. For example, water crisis. The world is covered with water. 70% of the earth is water, covered with at least. And yet there's no drinking water, So I didn't deliberately take the example of Singapore because you will say it's only 5 million or 7 million people. Japan
it's
is
also a very high energy footprint for that water.
Yeah, I mean,
therefore a very high carbon footprint.
Yeah. So you can't convert but I'm an optimist when it comes to scientific discoveries. That you're saying that have we found a less energy intensive way to convert saline seawater into drinking water currently? But if you are willing to believe that one day we'll be able to harness solar energy in such a way, but let me not go there. But that's why I took the example of Japan, which is 110 million people. South Korea is about 70 million people. These are not small countries. And if you are saying, Japan, by the way, back in 1970s, when the first oil price shock happened, it was the Japanese cars which introduced concepts of very high mileage. It was the Japanese influx of cars into the America, which led to a backlash against Japan. So if anything, Japan is actually at the forefront of not just renewable energy, but miniaturization and increasing mileage efficiency. So I don't think they are. But on this petroleum thing, I think it's beyond the scope of today's discussion. If you are saying that all of climate change is because of industrial, people say that industrial revolution, which is just 200 years old, is not. There is so much debate on this, whether that's the sole cause of the change, the high level, the ocean temperatures rising, which
I think Ajit, you need to not be reading the Republican think tank.
No, I'm not going there. I'm just saying that. I just want to ask the question: Would an average Indian want the kind of lifestyle which is enjoyed by Japan and South Korea? And if you tell me no, he's all misguided. Usko pata nahi hai ki what happens to climate change and all. That is not the right. That's very paternalistic. So I'm saying this.
So I think the question is, can I aspire to a lifestyle which I cannot have for others now and in the future? Isn't that the right way of putting it? Rather, Ashish.
Can I just add? It's not just about fossil fuels and petroleum. Japan today is able to do what it is able to do because it's taking significant amounts of rainforest away from Southeast Asia, replacing them with palm oil and all kinds of other things, and hardwoods that are imported from there. South Korea is exactly the same story. It has overfished seas well beyond South Korea and still does. So this offshoring of environmental and ecological impacts is something. So if you were to ask an Indian, do I want to live like a South Korean and Japanese? Maybe we'll say yes. But if you were to ask a indigenous native in Penang in Malaysia or somewhere in Indonesia whose lives are being destroyed by that lifestyle, they will tell that Indian, you can't. I'm sorry, that's not acceptable. And they will tell the South Korean and the Japanese also, if they had the power to do so. But unfortunately, we have a global economic system in which we can completely offshore and completely forget about all these costs because we're not paying them. There is no feedback loop that the Japanese are feeling for their consumption patterns, or the South Koreans are feeling for their consumption patterns. There is no feedback loop. So how do you build that in? If you build that feedback loop in, you'll find a very different system. And then maybe Indians will say, no, maybe we're better off as we are right now. So I think we need to look at, you can't look at it as nation states. In a planet which is globally interconnected ecologically, and now of course also economically, you can't look at nation states as singular entities. You have to look well beyond them. You have to look at there was a very interesting map that was produced by NGOs in the Netherlands of the global ecological footprint of the Netherlands. It is way beyond the few million people that live there. Let's please look at that also.
Incidentally, Japan gets 40-50% of its electricity from nuclear, but that's, after Fukushima, it's kind of slowed down a bit.
Right. For good reasons, perhaps. But I just wanted to sort of see the link between what both of you said. I think Ajit, earlier also you said that we need to price the environmental impacts into the system, so that if people are consuming too much timber, for instance, from Southeast Asia.
So we are getting better. No, for example, now he took the example of Penang and all that. I'm saying that we always push the envelope, right? We were earlier we were not pricing in all these things, partly out of ignorance, partly out of whatever. The power structure was not accountable enough. The more accountable we make our representatives, the more accountable we make our corporates to whatever actions they're doing. Earlier the smoke used to come out of the factory chimneys. Nobody worried about it, air quality. बोलते थे ये rich man का problem है. But today we know that air quality does not differentiate between a rich and a poor person. When I live in Mumbai, and people are concerned about vehicular pollution. So I think the more accountable you make it in an economic sense, in a political sense, the better we'll get. But this is never going to be perfect. But we keep pushing the envelope.
Obviously, you're looking at it from an incremental perspective of pushing the envelope. But
if you allow me one more, Sharath, give me 1 more minute on this. Just 2 more minutes. The best way to illustrate is through anecdotes. So imagine a very backward region of Marathwada, say near Aurangabad. Okay, it's a fallow land, and a big industrialist goes there. He wants to set up a steel factory there, or some factory. So he buys from villagers who push that. It's all fragmented land. So he goes to from villager to villager. Boss, I want your land. Kitne ko de rahe ho? They say, kitne denge aap denge? He says, I'll give you 50 rupees, whatever, gunta. No. Okay, 100 rupees. So finally, all the villagers, one by one, he manages to buy at 100 rupees a gunta. Then he sets up a factory there, and that factory produces some, say, fancy metal, and the metal has roaring business. And now around that, some industrial township comes. The land price has gone up from 100 rupees to a gunta to 10,000 rupees a gunta. Now the villagers are looking at it and say, boss, we got really looted. We got cheated. What shit is this, That we sold this guy 10 years ago, we sold it at 100 rupees a gunta. The price of land has gone up. When you had used the word price earlier. So does that mean the villagers were cheated?
So I'll give you an example of Kalinganagar, right? So in
I'm just asking you.
I'm coming to exactly that example. I'm saying in the vast majority of the cases, the acquisition is being done by the state at throwaway prices, being sold to developers at low prices.
That's why I didn't bring that.
And then the developers are making the money.
So forget about the coercive element. I'm talking purely free market, free choice transaction.
I think that's a longer conversation. Ajit, I agree, but I'm saying that's a longer conversation about what constitutes free market transactions. Free transactions.
So therefore, I have a solution for this. I'm saying, in fact, during the 10 years ago in Parliament, this was discussed. So they said that we can have completely voluntary transactions, but you need to tie in the prosperity of the project and the land to the people. So you have to give each family at least one job in that factory, and you have to give them shares. So,
but Ajit, suppose you go even more fundamental and say that we build a process, and I'm not talking here abstraction because there are lots of examples of this. A process by which within the village itself, the villagers from their land can actually earn as much or more than what your factory might end up giving them with agriculture, with small scale processing, with crafts, with etc. And I can give you hundreds of examples where that's happening. Why would the villagers want to sell their land in the first place? They'd be happy where they are. Unfortunately, again, we're going roundabout. we seem to want to go roundabout saying, okay, let's first take the land and then give them adequate compensation, और उसको लेके फिर वो कहीं और जाएंगे और कुछ और करेंगे. ये सीधा दो, सीधा support करो उसको.
I just want to add to that, Ashish. My experience in Jharkhand. So in the midst of COVID, I had to go to Jharkhand for an NGT, National Green Tribunals Committee on looking at environmental violations in the coal mining belt of North Karanpura coal fields. And what you see there is, Ajit, sort of the travesty of free market transactions, right? Where the Coal Mining Act, Coal Bearing Areas Act means that if there is coal under your land, you have no rights. The state has the right to acquire the land in the interest of national interest of coal production, and some quote unquote fair price will be determined. So, and then as a concession in recent times, we have had this sort of 5% mineral development fund. 5% of the coal company's profits go into the mineral development fund, which sits in the district collector's hands and is used to build bus stops or something else which have nothing to do with the well-being of those people who lost their lands and so on and so forth. So it's a very long distance between what you said, sort of free market transactions, and what is actually the reality on the ground in terms of uninformed, coercive kind of processes. So public hearings, if you look at public hearings,
our quality of democracy is to improve. Basically,
so I just wanted to tie that last bit together to come. I think both of you have talked about structures, the economic structures, the inequality in economic structures that can lead to coercion even in the marketplace, in a sense. The inequality in the political structures, the high level of centralization, whether it is colonial, post-colonial, even post-73rd Amendment, as you said, not really translating on the ground, or as Ashish said, sort of the grassroots democracy, nowhere near in the picture. So that's the political structure that needs to be reformed. I wanted to end with just a thought, and again, we cannot deal with this question seriously, but the thought that somewhere as an individual, let's say I'm enjoying the cheap wood that's coming out of Indonesia to build the table on which actually I placed my laptop just now, right? So I have absolutely no incentive to increase the rights of the indigenous people of Indonesia to say no to conversion of tropical rainforest into timber plantations or one-time felling of the forest, right? Just like I have no incentive as a person sitting in Bangalore and enjoying electricity coming from Raichur thermal power plant, where the coal is coming from Jharkhand for feeding that thermal power plant. I have no incentive in getting the Jharkhandis their rights on minerals or land or to a fairer process, of negotiation, right? So at some level, it seems to me that unless I actually share those values, it's not enough to say, well, we will change the structures, because who will change the structures? It's only if I actually feel that if I were in the Jharkhandi shoes, I would actually want those rights. If I were in the Penang person's shoes, I would want control over my immediate environment and forest and so on. So if it's only if I'm able to put myself in their place and therefore develop a value system which is beyond myself, that there is some hope, in the future.
So I know they're trying to wrap up, but let me just tell you, you may know, you're sitting in a city, I'm sitting in a city, you're sitting, we don't know that in fact the electricity that we're enjoying comes from burning coal, which as you said came from Jharkhand. The buildings that we sit in are made from cement, which comes from limestone, which comes from Chhattisgarh. The steel that we enjoy, our buildings are made up of steel, comes from iron ore, which is again from that part of the country. And वहाँ से जब migrants आते हैं, Bombay में we don't do migrant. We want the iron ore and the limestone and the coal. But to answer your question, we should, it's not like, of course you should, I mean, empathy and all these moral and spirit, I mean, qualities, ethical qualities, of course, we all want it. But if you give the same rights to Jharkhandis to decide, what Ashish was saying, the village in Gadchiroli. So similarly, when the Niyamgiri thing happened, you remember the bauxite, the mine was supposed to be, but the Niyamgiri tribal hamlet decided ki humko yahan nahi chahiye. So if we agree that whatever rights you enjoy as a Bangalorean, or whatever rights that Ashish enjoys as a Punekar, or whatever rights I enjoy, the same rights are available and the same autonomy of decision making is available to everybody in the country, whether they're an Adivasi or a villager or a city goer. But I want to just conclude by one final thought. While it's good to talk about the autonomy, the 73rd, 74th Amendment, empowering village councils and the village panchayats, I'll just take one more minute. There was a small village called Dabhol, which was overjoyed when it came to know that there was a 12,000 crore project coming up in the village limits. So they just charged them a tax of 0.1% so that money could be used to build a local school and a hospital. they were snubbed royally and they went all the way to the Supreme Court and they lost the case. So much for village autonomy. But I'm just saying that while we talk about village autonomy, village council and the Panchayati Raj, or, there was one famous Indian who said, life in the village is nasty, brutish, and a cesspool of casteism. That was Dr. Ambedkar. So let's be careful about romanticizing too much about village power. According to Dr. Ambedkar, the aspiration is to come to the cities and all, but that's beyond the scope of today's discussion. So over to you, back to you.
Ashish, last words on this point. That was a very provocative point that Ajit is leaving us with. So,
well, I think if you look at any of the recent Dalit movements, including the Dalit women farmers that I spoke about, or people like Jignesh Mevani and all, they would put a lot of qualifiers on what Ambedkar ji said. I mean, I think Ambedkar's basic point about eradicating casteism is absolutely fundamental to this. But to eradicate villages is absolutely not fundamental to this, because our cities are anyway creaking at the joints. There's no way we can have such high levels of urbanization and not collapse. It's already collapsing, which is not to say that you force villagers not to come, but that one creates the situations. And again, as I said, there are so many examples. You create the situations in which villagers actually are enjoying being in the village, and maybe lots of city dwellers will also say, oh gosh, so much better quality of life, we will want to go to the village, which is also what's happening. So let's not go back to cliched things that people have said. There's a lot of cliches from our past, but to actually see what is the current situation and look at, if you look at Kudumbashree as an example, for instance, in Kerala, or if you look at Ralegan Siddhi and so many others, or if you look at some of the villages where Jharcraft has worked in Jharkhand, or if you look at the examples I gave you from Gadchiroli and so on, these are places where people are not actually necessarily wanting to leave the village. In fact, people are coming back. Villagers, young people have come back to Kutch, to villages in Kutch where they're getting a good livelihood based on their handloom weaving. So I think that's the kind of stuff we need to talk about, instead of this whole thing that everybody has to be coming to cities because that's the only place where the opportunities are available, which we also know is not true. 50-60% of India's city dwellers are actually living in horrible conditions. And now that millions of people have gone back, a lot of them are actually saying we don't necessarily want to go back to the cities or industrial zones. Do we have options to stay back in the village? And that's, I think, the kind of work we really need to focus on. If the Atmanirbhar Bharat package was truly focused on revitalizing both villages and creating different situations in towns and cities for true self-reliance, not self-reliance meaning that we will auction 40 coal blocks in central India and become self-reliant with coal, but true self-reliance at the level of each community, then I think we would see a very different picture than what we're seeing now, where out of distress, people are having to migrate to cities.
Thanks, Ashish. I'm going to end this with thanks to both of you. And also the point, I think, that lies in common, which is that just like we said, economic inequality will militate against any notion, even the simplest notion of free market. Political inequality or concentration of power will, uproot any ideas of reasoned political decisions. Caste inequality is another structure which also we, as Ashish had flagged in the beginning, we will have to fight to make grassroots democracy a genuine democracy. So the question of, I think, genuine democracy and the need to then make it work in the presence of economic inequality, political inequality, and caste inequality. How do we make that genuine democracy work? I think that's a common point between all that we have discussed so far, amongst many other things. I just wanted to flag that the idea of democracy is much deeper than, as you said, both of you said, the idea of just casting votes. It's an issue of constant engagement and goes back to then our roles as citizens, beyond just our roles as consumers in this modern economy. So on that note, and a final point about what I was trying to get at, the issue of values, that we can't talk about the change that has to be out there unless we share those values. I can't say that the government should give the Adivasis rights if I don't believe that I'm willing to pay whatever price that involves for my electricity from Jharkhand, or my aluminium from the bauxite mines of Odisha and so on. So the willingness to put myself in other people's shoes, the willingness to put myself in the shoes of future generations, and at the point that Ashish made, the willingness to put myself in the shoes of even non-humans, in some sense, to sense what is the kind of world we want to live in. I think that is also central to this structural change that we are talking about, that both of you really described in very different but very interesting and fascinating ways. So Thanks to both of you, Ashish and Ajit, for a fascinating 1.5 hours. And I'm going to hand the baton back to my colleagues in Ecological Society.
Thanks, Sharad. Thanks, Ajit.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Shatakshi, if you could take over
Yes.
and present a word of thanks.
Yes,
Maybe
absolutely.
you can. My suggestion is that we have had a lot of questions, and
Mhm.
we have not been able to do justice to all these questions. So
Yes.
maybe we will try and see if some of these could be taken up offline, and so that we can at least do some partial justice to the set of questions that were raised. Yeah.
Yes, yes. I can see the chat box itself and the question answer box was on fire. People had so much to say and so much to ask and contribute and discuss. I think I'm very sad that we have such less time today for this discussion. But thank you so much, panelists, for making the time, for being here. I can see that there were very diverging opinions, but also we could see some kind of middle path emerging despite these very different opinions. It was very exciting to hear both of you and Sharad sir talk about this very complex question on what kind of economy do we want. I'm sure all of us really enjoyed the range from economics at home to economics globally, and all the different diversities that we spoke about: caste, gender, the urban-rural separation or divide. It was extremely fascinating. So thank you so much once again. We will continue having these discussions every month from now. We have 3 different topics in the next months, which is food, water, and understanding the city. And then ultimately we'll have a tying up session where we will come together and see what the way forward can be, what we can synthesize from all these different discussions. So I hope all of you in the audience can join us again. I can see there were over 375 people here with us on Zoom, and there were over 40 people watching us on Facebook. I'm so glad that so many people could join us and listen in on this very fascinating and exciting discussions. I would like to thank Kisan, who helped us organize the Zoom proceedings so smoothly. Niriksha, Deepak, and Niranjan sir, thank you so much for making this so easy and fun to organize. I would also like to mention Santosh Lalwani sir. He was my batchmate during the Ecological Society course. Even though he's one of us, I'd like to thank him because this conference, the idea of the conference was his brainchild, and it's because of his perseverance and his passion that we were able to take it forward, and this discussion was able to see the light of the day. So thank you so much, Santosh sir. And finally, thank you to the entire FES team, the FES members who, not thank you, kudos that we got so many people together, we got such an exciting discussion happening, and the rest of the months that are going to come. So with that, I will stop. Thank you so much. Good night and see you next month. Bye-bye.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.